Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Eby. I'm the CEO of First Street Foundation, and we're just getting everyone joining the room. I'll give it a couple seconds as the attendee list clicks up and my panelists can join us. Okay. Well, seeing that we're at 12:01 or 9:01, depending where you are in the country, well, why don't we get kicked off? As mentioned, my name is Matthew Eby, and I'm the CEO of the First Street Foundation. And with me today is Dr. Jeremy Porter. Jeremy is our head of climate implications, and will be running through the presentation with me, as well as Dr. Jung Ho Kim, who is our lead hydrologist and the lead author on the paper and model of the First Street Foundation precipitation model, and that we will be discussing the results of today. A couple pieces of housekeeping. We have the Q&A enabled. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. If you click on that and submit a question, we will do our best to get to that. In all honesty, we had over 1,000 people register. So we will do our best to get to every question, but if there's a lot, we will follow up at the end of the webinar with a copy of the recording, as well as written answers to grouped questions that all seem around the same. So we'll be following that up with an email for everyone. So with that out of the way, please, I encourage you to drop questions in the Q&A, and then as we answer them, they'll be able to appear for everyone else. So I'll start off now by sharing my screen and running through the overall slides that we have for you today. So first and foremost, we are First Street Foundation. As you may know, we are a nonprofit. We started about 7 years ago. And the whole idea of everything that we do is to communicate the risks associated with climate change. The thing that we found that is the best way to do that is by creating physical climate models, flood, heat, fire, drought, things of that nature, and applying it to structures, homes, warehouses, commercial buildings, government buildings, and quantifying the risk so that people understand not only what is that risk today, but how will it change over the next 30 years, the typical period of a mortgage. And so that's really, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with all of these models and everything that we do. Within that, we like to think that we are helping people through flood, wildfire, heat, and hurricane winds through our risk factor tool. So not only do we build models that we talk about, and we'll talk about today with our specific precipitation model and the implications there, but we also take all of that information and apply it to risk factor. So anyone can go to riskfactor.com, type in an address, and see what their risk is today and how it'll change over the next 30 years, as I was just mentioning. Everything we do is built at the property level. So these are custom built models, like our precipitation model, to allow you to understand that risk, and specifically built to quantify that risk in that way. So for an individual structure. And then we're also able to look at things like damage and downtime from these events through a partnership that we have with a large engineering firm called AirUp. So we have this quantified for every structure. We have it in our tool, and we've integrated it with Realtor.com and Redfin and Crexi and Estately, and it's really publicly available for citizens, as well as in bulk and data access for states and governments and institutional investors and financial institutions and so on and so forth. And before we kind of dig in, the other thing that we like to talk about is that everything that we do is open and transparent. So we can send this out, as I mentioned, with links to all of our peer-reviewed studies, whether it's our wildfire model, our flood model, extreme heat, wind, or climate implications, as Jeremy leads with our group in a very emerging field, not just what's happening to properties or what's happening to communities, but past that, what does that mean for climate migration, or what does that mean for tax bases or property values, things of that nature. So with that, we like to think that these custom built models, everything, because it's transparent and peer reviewed, it's vetted by millions of people on a daily basis that see it on these real estate websites. It's property specific, and we really communicate the risk in a way that's intuitive and beyond the property, that really we are able to garner this trust. So it's with that spirit that we really want to dig into the precipitation report today and explain our findings and really go through this with Dr. Porter and Dr. Kim on the findings that we have and why we actually built this overall. So I'll start us off with a little bit on why we built this and what we see right now with precipitation. I'll then pass it back and forth with Dr. Kim on the finding or on how we built the model, and then Jeremy will talk about the implications of this. But at a high level, NOAA since 1980 has been tracking billion-dollar-plus natural disasters, and from that we can see that precipitation events just over time using CPI-adjusted indicators have moved from about half an event to 1.5, so about 3x what they were previously. And with that, this was some great information that Dr. Porter found for us that came from the EPA. And so it looks at a high level, so the land area across the country by year, and then says how many parts of the country or from landmass area experienced an extreme precipitation event that year. And so extreme being defined locally. But as you can see, it was pretty stationary until about 1980, where we see this inflection point where all of a sudden you start to see a trend line that's much different than we have in the past. Jeremy, I don't know if there's anything you want to weigh in on this past that.
Yeah, well, I think these last two slides are really good at illustrating the point that on the one hand, in inflation adjusted dollars, we're seeing more of these billion-dollar events over time, so they are becoming more severe. And then in this case, if you look at this data from the EPA in their own text, they highlight the fact that most areas that were receiving extreme precipitation events were pretty constant until about 1980. And they found 1980 as sort of an inflection point. If you look at the data in this space, you can see that as you have moved past 1980, we see a lot more areas being exposed to extreme precipitation. So it's both more severe from the NOAA billion-dollar disasters, but also more likely in a lot of areas from this EPA data.
Yeah, and I think the other important point, which you've made previously, and we have bolded here, is that the top 10 extreme one-day precipitation events have all occurred since 1995, a good indicator there. So really with that, how do we measure precipitation in this country? So NOAA has been creating the Atlas 14 data set, which is the gold standard for precipitation data in the country. It is the authoritative source, as they say within their text. So this is used by DOTs across the country, whether it's New Jersey, which we've spoken to about this, or Texas, or wherever you are. DOTs use this because it's the baseline data that the government's put out for everyone to use. It's also used by DOE. It's used in building code standards. If you're building a stormwater system or anything like that, that is the type of information that you're using to understand essentially how big of a pipe to put in the ground or how high to make a building or any of those things that go into it. And then the other thing that is really important is when you're making a precipitation model, you want to compare it to other models. You want to look at other precipitation models to make sure you're in the right ballpark. So it's also the validation source for a lot of local precipitation models that engineering companies make. And so really kind of high level, wherever you see kind of built infrastructure happening, Atlas 14 is typically involved in some way. And that's because that's what we use as a country. The thing that we see is a little bit different, though, is that when Atlas 14 as a methodology was created, the idea of climate change wasn't kind of prolific as it is today. It wasn't this well-researched area. It was the idea of stationarity, I should say, where you look at a data set over time and you see, okay, well, if we see all of these observations, let's look at the median of this because that will give us a good indication of what an extreme event might be. And so if we're looking at that and we see a big data set, that's a smart idea. But if you see an actual trend line that is going up and to the right because it is warmer and the atmosphere holds more water vapor and precipitation events are changing, then this idea of a median event is not the best way to do that anymore. So this is not something that NOAA did on purpose or anything like that. It's just the methodology that was deployed at the time and what is used across the board. So our example here is that if you look at the last 20 years of data versus the full data set, you get a difference of almost 3x. You have 148% difference. So this is just a way to illuminate the idea of what happens when you take this stationarity approach and you look at the median value versus more recent events, and you don't have the same you have the same weighting across the entire duration without understanding that climate change is happening, precipitation events are changing. Dr. Kim, Dr. Porter, anything to add on that?
Yeah, this time series is exactly showing the two implications. One is how the extreme precipitation has been increasing. And then when we do not considering this kind of increasing trend, and then the non-stationarity of the extreme precipitation, this will make a huge difference in the precipitation model building. So as you guys know, the LS14 is based on the stationary methodology, which cannot account for this part of the fact. But I want to highlight that this is something what we covered in our model.
Yeah, great. And so if you take this idea that the median of these full sets of data that are looked at represent the year that the median would be in, the atmosphere that would have happened at that time, because you're looking at it over that set of years. Really, the median is going to say, well, this is what the average would be, and the average is going to be in the middle, and what would that year be? That would be the environment that you're actually looking at. And we can see that around 75% of the rain gauges that are used in the Atlas 14 methodology represent data from 1980 or older. And so there are definitely newer sets that are growing up by new rain gauges that are put in, but the ones that especially have been around the longest, or ones that were around older periods of time and then were decommissioned, that's where you see really, really old data that are still used in the methodology. So this graph gives a good idea of across the board from all the rain gauges and the data sets that are used, what is the average age, the average environment that is used within that Atlas 14 methodology. Jeremy or Jung Ho, anything to add there?
Yeah, this is actually a good indicator to measure how the NOAA Atlas older and outdated from now. So the middle point in technical perspective, it is a kind of the expectation year of the we can represent it, what's going to be the expectation of heavy precipitation that from the NOAA Atlas and what's going to be the amount. So if you have seen the expectation from NOAA Atlas 100 meter, and if you look at the what stand for that amount, and you can see that that is always already the 30-year or 50-year outdated amount based on what the NOAA Atlas did it based on their data and the methodologies.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think in a state of stationarity, long observation records are preferred. We want more data. We want to be able to pull in as much data as possible, Absolutely. Go back as far as we can possibly. What the problem, especially when you start to couple this with the regional frequency analysis that is employed in the model, is that as you have these metrics that aren't accounting for the stationarity, and they are correcting back essentially to a climate that occurred, that existed into the past, these older records become more problematic in that sense, only in the case that they don't allow you to understand what's occurring today. But in general, as a data scientist, as somebody who works with these types of records, you want more observations. There's nothing wrong with more observations. The more, the better. You just want to make sure you're accounting for what the current trends are in that analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we were saying, this is not a critique. It's just the methodology that was deployed at the time, which has continued to kind of be pushed through all the way up into recent Atlas 14 estimates that have been deployed. And so another interesting input to the models that comes with some human error is that there's about 11,000 gauges that are used, rain gauges, by NOAA within this process. And they include everything from the super high-end ASOS data, rain gauge data that comes from these constantly calibrated, digitally recorded stations across the country, to the USGS tipping point rain gauges that are affixed on top of the stream gauges, and every 6 weeks, someone goes out and gets the rain gauge data and sends that back in to kind of your backyard meteorologist. There's over 8,500 volunteer contributors that go to the rain gauge and then record the results, and they can do everything from manually record them and mail them in to upload them to the National Weather Service. And obviously, the more humans you involve in this and the more error you can typically get across the board. This is just a main point to say, not all of this rain gauge data is the exact same. These rain gauges differ widely in how they collect the information, how much information they collect, and then how they're recorded. So you can't look at them all as the same set of data. Again, to Jeremy's point earlier, more data is typically better when you have this idea of a data scientist perspective on these things, but sometimes that's not the case when you're not comparing apples to apples, especially when you're trying to do something like local rain gauge patterns. And so what that means is then you need to ensure that you have the right data, knowing that you have different data sources. So and I don't pretend I'm not the scientist in the group, that's Jeremy and Jung Ho, but one of the normal methods is smoothing that you deploy to try and bring out noise in data collection and in the modeling methodology. But one of the things that NOAA does aggressively smooths the data set for these errors, which you can see the blue is the smooth set, the red is the recorded observations from the West Coast going through the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains out to the east. And so what you can see are those dramatic drops in elevation where it's really been smoothed out into the actual data set that's recorded and then leveraged. Jeremy or Jung Ho, you have anything to add on smoothing techniques?
Yeah, the smoothing is one of the biggest difference between the NOAA and what the first three did it. Actually, the well-known finding from the smoothing part in the NOAA side is really hard to see the spatial variation even in the mountain area where we expecting the heavy precipitation by orographic and any other atmosphere and then topographic land interaction. So this is something we have to highlight to do not lose the local flood risk. So I think that is a really good point by highlighting this kind of the variation by capturing the first stream model, especially around the mountain areas.
Perfect. And so lastly, because of all of these elements, when you are deploying Atlas 14 as a methodology, NOAA goes out and they try and get the money for it. And then once they actually have the funds to create a version of it, you can literally see, as you can see in this corner here between Nebraska and Colorado, the difference between vintages. And so if this idea of stationarity in this methodology was showing similar results over time, you wouldn't have these dramatic differences if you were trying to deploy something like you're building critical infrastructure, right? The in between these two states. Would you be looking at this really dark point from Nebraska, or would you be looking at the lighter point from Colorado? It's just a demonstration of the differences between the two. So this idea that they're at different time series, you're going to get different results, but it shouldn't be as dramatic, which is pronounced by the other things that we were talking about with this stationarity idea and not necessarily reflecting the differences between the averages. So with that,
I'll just jump in real quick, man. I would just say that, all of these things that we're covering at this point are sort of known issues. The precipitation modelers know that these are issues. NOAA knows that these are issues. We're going to talk in a few minutes. Yeah, NUTMAS going on and going to talk about the fact that we are actually, NOAA's moving to an Atlas 15 model, which is going to correct for a lot of these different issues that pop up. But as you can see, as we walk through those different components, they tend to underestimate from those first couple of slides the increasing likelihood and the increasing severity, and that's really what we focused on in regard to the differences in the two models at this point. Not to, we know that we wanted to just make sure to note that NOAA knows that these are issues, and NOAA is working on the issue.
Yeah. It's a good transition there, Jeremy. You know, like the thing that NOAA's been trying to get money for years for this. This isn't a new observation that we have just stumbled upon. Everyone has been hoping that NOAA would get this money so that we can build out Atlas 15, and then that can be leveraged. So that finally did happen in 2022. It's no small feat. From the Office of Water Prediction, they received the first ever federal fundings to update Atlas 14, which will be called Atlas 15, as Jeremy's saying, and account for climate change. And so it's not just updating for the current methodological standard, it's also going to then look out into the future and provide estimates for the next 30, 50, and 100 years, I believe. So this is great because you're going to see this new data set come online. It's going to correct for these things that we're talking about. It's already been awarded and starting to being worked on. The only downside that we see is that we have to wait until 2027 for the results. And so in the meantime, we are going to have to continue to work on Atlas 14 data for all of those different standards that we were talking about and leveraging that data, even though we all are aware of the shortcomings of it, and that is generating results that aren't necessarily what we're going to see today, let alone for the next 30 years. And that is a big problem because we have a lot of infrastructure money being poured into the country, let alone for the other things that we are just normally doing on a day-by-day basis as a country. So there's been $1.2 trillion that has been allocated from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's called the IJA Act, as well as the IRA, which also has secondary funds that are going into this. So these are just two sources of the funding. This is generational spend on infrastructure that is going to be, by 2027, vast majority allocated in shovels in ground. There's already projects right now that have shovels in ground that are being built out with the Atlas 14 standard from this money. And so you can see from this in this little kind of infographics at the bottom where the money's going. But obviously roads and bridges, airports and ports, everything from passenger and freight rail, all of these things that are really big infrastructure projects are leveraging Atlas 14 data to understand what is the severity of precipitation events, how big or thick should the pipe be in the ground from the engineering projects. All of these kind of concepts are being not only built to, but allocated. So when you think of where does the money get allocated to, you're looking at it from how much money do I need? Well, let's look at the engineering standards from Atlas 14, and then you get the back of the envelope estimates to then submit them, so on and so forth. That's generated from the amount of precip you're seeing there and the cost that you think would be associated with it. So that's the main issue, one of the main issues that we're seeing on the speed that we need to move under this. So that is not something we knew was going to happen. We knew about the shortcomings of Atlas like everyone else did, and we didn't want to wait for funding to come through. And so we had started a while ago on building out our own precipitation model to address these issues. So this kind of unified national approach with the most recent data, only using the ASOS data, and not using this overcorrection with smoothing because we can trust the rain gauges to a greater extent, given that we're only using the ASOS data. And then we can do that climate adjustment that NOAA is going to do in this next model, which was never a part of Atlas 14. Jeremy, Jung Ho, do you want to say anything else about the model itself?
Jung Ho? Well, I was just going to add that, and this has gone through a number of iterations. So we've gone through both peer review, but also presentations at AGU and AMS. We've interacted with the folks at NOAA, talked to them about our model, received questions from them, presented it out to them. So we are, as part of this process in building out the model, we've done our best to walk through and in due diligence all of the steps associated with producing the peer-reviewed sort of scientifically defensible precipitation model.
And I also noticed that there will be the more paper that will cover how we develop the national scale this precipitation model, and also what's going to be the implication, and that will show us which area and the how much dramatically changed in the extreme precipitation and how it is above the current national standard.
Yeah, great. So as mentioned, our Precip model has been through the Journal of Hydrology and was peer reviewed there. And so really now it kind of takes us to, now that we had this model, we have all of this data from the First Street Foundation flood model, which included Atlas 14, and now we're updating to use our precipitation model, which we'll talk about later on. But we were able to then compare results and see, okay, what does Atlas 14 tell us from the data that is collected using that methodology, where it's available. Some parts of the country have Atlas 2 versus Atlas 14. But what are we seeing that's the difference between that and the First Street Foundation model? So I'll pass it over to Dr. Porter to run us through all the implications here.
Yeah, and just for context, we focused on these implications on a specific scenario where we're focused on the 1 in 100 year return period. And what we're really focused on is the precipitation rate and the depth of water for the 1 in 100 year return period from the NOAA Atlas 14 record and from our own models. So that's essentially what we're looking at here. Within any given county, which is the level of geographic aggregation that we're looking at on the maps, we're taking the median in this case. So it shows you the median sort of return period conversion. And the way to interpret that, if you're looking at the map, the darkest of blues would tell us that the depth of water and the precipitation rate from a 1 in 100 year event from NOAA Atlas 14 in that location, that same depth of water would occur between 1 in 5 and a 1 in 10, which would be around a 10-year return period, or what we would expect to see every 100 years in the NOAA Atlas 14 precipitation records. We're actually seeing about every 10 years. If you adjust for climate, you look at the First Street Foundation model. You can sort of see that variation, how that changes across space, the Northeast and the Midwest, which we know in the recent past have seen large increases in precipitation risk as the primary driver of their increases in flooding. Recently see the biggest deviation from Atlas 14. So it makes sense that these are the places that are seeing the biggest impact from climate on precipitation events. And these are also the places where we're seeing that largest underestimation of risk of severity of extreme precipitation events. There's a couple other pockets that pop up down around Houston, Louisiana border. We see another pocket in that area, oftentimes driven by not necessarily the increasing numbers of tropical cyclones. There's not evidence that that's actually the case, but oftentimes the increasing strength of these events are stronger, they move slower, and they end up dropping more precipitation oftentimes. And we see some evidence of that in these differential precipitation records. And there's a couple out on the Northwest California on both sides of the mountains, both on the east side and the west side. And a lot of that has to do with the smoothing differences that take place around mountains, where we end up seeing that we're removing a lot of the really extreme events from those locations as we smooth over large areas. And when you look at a more extra local understanding of what the precipitation rate is versus that smooth rate, we're seeing an underestimation associated with that. We saw that just in this last year, where we saw a number of, for instance, atmospheric rivers come across California, really extreme precipitation events that weren't being accounted for by not accounting for the stationarity in the larger precipitation process. If you look at the table attached to this map, we've tried to quantify this both in terms of space and in terms of population. So in space, we use counties. We know they're irregular shaped units. They're not all the same size, but just in general, if you look at the places on that top line where a 1 in 100 year NOAA Atlas depth is actually can be converted to a 1 in 100 or a 1 in 50 year or lower return period, lower being more frequent return period. There's about 1,100 counties that fall into that category, and about 51% of the population, about 167 million people in the US live in counties where that's the case on average, or using the median in that county for the conversion. So that means that in these places, the depth of water or the rainfall rate that we expect to be a 1 in 100 year event is actually occurring about twice as often, about every 50 years if you look at the updated record. If you go down the line a little bit, maybe to the 20 year or lower, we're seeing about 13% of the population, or about 44 million of the population in the United States live in counties where the 1 in 100 year depth occurs 5 times more frequently And we know that, there's some concern about the way in which the return periods and probabilities are presented out. A 1 in 100-year event is really just a probability for any given year. So we understand that it's not that you have a 1 in 100-year event. You won't have another one for 100 years. Every year that resets to where theoretically you should have a 1% chance of that rate. But what we're seeing, and we've heard anecdotally, are people saying, it sounds like I just had a 100-year event 5 years ago, or it feels like I've had a 100-year event every 10 years. And the reason why is because we're underestimating what an actual 100-year event. People are feeling that because it's actually happening. The 100-year rate isn't actually indicative of what the risk is in today's climate. Maybe Matt, we can go to the next slide. So we looked at this across the country. We really tried to focus in on high population areas just to get a feel for places that had a significant population that were being impacted by this underestimation of risk. These are the types of places that have large infrastructure projects associated with stormwater management, large adaptation projects associated with protecting communities and property from potential pluvial or precipitation related flooding. And so if you look at a couple of these places on this map and on this table, some of the places that pop out right outside of Philadelphia in Chester County, Pennsylvania, a 1 in 100-year event, or the depth of water associated with that rainfall rate is actually occurring about once every 11 years in our model today. And that changes to just under 1 in 10 years in 30 years. So the biggest takeaway as we started to produce the results from our report was that the well-known underestimation in NOAA Atlas 14, if that's just corrected for today, there's a big jump in regard to the understanding of likelihood and severity of extreme precipitation events, but that's only going to change as we move into the future. So we have 30 more years, we're going to continue to see this increase. NOAA Atlas 15 has presented out a flyer recently. They're going to continue to correct out into the future. So we know that this is going to be accounted for moving into the future. So the main thing we're trying to draw attention to here is, yes, it's important to correct for our current understanding, but it's important to also understand future risk as well. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so, and here we've broken it down more based on population centers. So we had the counties in the last slide, but here you can actually see population centers that are pretty significant and fall within that dark blue area all along the East Coast from Washington up to Boston. We have major metropolitan areas that have a significant underestimation of their current risk to extreme precipitation events. Baltimore popped up as number 1 in our list when we just aggregated to major cities. A 1 in 100-year event occurs about once every 15 years in the current climate. It'll change to about a 1 in 12. In the future climate, places like New York pop up. A 1 in 100 it occurs about once every 20 years, 1 in 19 here. It'll increase to about a 1 in 14 in 30 years. And then there's places like Houston, for instance, that have the biggest differences as you look at the global climate models in regard to precipitation increases into the future. There's like a bullseye right over that part of the Gulf Coast, and you can actually see it in the models as you project out into the future, where a 1 in 100 today occurs about once every 23 years, or about 4 times as likely. But as you move into the future, that moves into a 1 in 11, so about 10 times as likely. And remember, this conversion is really the depth of water in the NOAA Atlas 1 in 100-year event. How often would we expect to see that today in the current climate? And how often would we expect to see that if we were to forecast out into the future using the global climate models in 30 years? And so this, Matt pointed out earlier that, we have this once in a generation spend around the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act that's allocated about $1.2 trillion to infrastructure improvements across the country. There are these projects that have already started. There's shoveling ground across the country. One that we found was this $86.1 million 4-year construction project in New Jersey. In a lot of states' DOT plans, their design standards actually require them to use NOAA Atlas 14. We also have seen that New Jersey, among other states, are already understanding this as an issue or trying to correct for the issue and trying to add additional years into their Atlas volume so that they can understand the impact the climate's having. Lots of times they're still using a non-stationary approach. So while they're using more years, it's still not quite indicative of the current risk, but it is just a single example, the design standards for this project. And there's a couple of links on here that we can share out when we share out the responses to the questions. But these links essentially link out to the project. They link out to the Department of Transportation Design Standards and the actual design standards for this project, which were a 1 in 10 in some areas of the roadway and a 1 in 15 in other areas. And the project is explicitly directed to improve drainage issues on the road. We went out, we talked to some folks in that area. Matt actually went himself and was told by multiple people in that area the road floods all the time. There's a good reason why money's been allocated to this project to improve this road standard. But if you look in this area and you look at the actual 1 in 10 and 1 in 15 return period conversions, if you update them to today's climate, those depths of water actually occur 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 times today's. And in the future, they're going to occur 1 in 2 and 1 in 3 years. So that means that in the areas that are designed to a 1 in 10 standard, they're actually going to flood in 30 years about every other year. And we already know that, you know, the engineers will know that concrete and asphalt is compromised when it's flooded, but also just the useful life of the road itself is going to deteriorate with the repetitive flooding associated with not designing it to a standard that protects it against an actual 1 in 10 flood depth. I don't know, Matt, if you wanted to add anything on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point. I mean, the idea, this is what Atlas 15 is doing, right? Like they are correcting these things, but they're also doing the climate adjustments into the future, because when you're looking at things like infrastructure, your useful life is not, you know, a 1 year or 5 year or something like that. You're putting things in the ground, you're building these things for, it could be 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, whatever it might be. You want that duration, that useful life to be accounted for. And so even if you do the corrections, it's just as important to look at how we can see through the climate models, the adjustments in precipitation that are going to take place, so that you can then understand with uncertainty. We are not saying that we have the, you know, the crystal ball to say exactly what's going to happen 30 years from now or 50 years from now. Within the uncertainty bounds that you can see within these models and within the future projections, are we building to the right standard or not? Because that's what you're seeing here in this example, which we chose specifically because it's happening right now, shovels in the ground, it's $86 million, and it's being built to a it's literally being done to prevent flooding. But we see from looking at the methodological approach that it's not going to have the desired outcome. The useful life will not be as long as Jeremy was just talking about. And then in 30 years, I mean, every other year is what we would expect to see this 1 in 10 flooding event that is being built to a standard for. So these are just the problems that we're seeing without having that new data sooner. And we're monitoring the questions in the chat. We'll get to them at the end, as many as we can, and then we'll respond out with them. But I saw a bunch on there of, have we talked to NOAA about this? NOAA is well aware. They're trying to work on this right now. We've engaged with them. We've sent them our paper and our data, and we'd love to work with any cities or states or federal governments, agencies on this by leveraging our data. I mean, that's the goal of this whole thing. So how do we potentially have a stopgap between the gold standard 2027 data that's coming and today? Like, what can we do in between? We have data. There's a question in there that I saw on how would you expect local engineers or stormwater management folks to use this data? Would we expect them to use this data instead of Atlas 14, or while they're waiting for Atlas 15? We would suggest that if our data is showing that something is dramatically different than what the Atlas 14 data is showing, that you need to invest in more local research, that there's clearly a signal there that something could be dramatically different. We're not saying go build $86 million road based off of our data alone. You should have the local floodplain manager and the local engineers look at it, especially when you're seeing a big delta between the two of what we would perceive the current risk to be from Atlas 14 and what our model's telling you. Diligence needs to be done there so that we're ensuring that we're building to the right standard. But outside of just kind of this, and we don't mean to pick on this road in New Jersey, there are literally hundreds of these projects going on in every single state. So it's not just a New Jersey problem, it is a nationwide problem that we're seeing. But with that, it's not just about infrastructure. It's also about, and there was a bunch of questions about this as well, on the National Flood Insurance Program. And so one of the main things that we know is that with FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program, they don't model precipitation events as a standalone risk that would dictate where the special flood hazard area is. And so for a quick primer, for those of you who aren't in the weeds on this stuff, the special flood hazard area is what mandates who has to buy flood insurance and who does not have to buy flood insurance. And so the way that it is created is by a local study is performed. It involves the community and business owners and FEMA and the government and the local government. And eventually this map is created and passed, and it shows where the 1% zone is, the 1% or greater risk. And then it has the base flood elevation, and that's any properties within there are going to have to buy a flood insurance policy if they have a federally backed mortgage. Outside of that, it's your choice. Because there's no precipitation in that modeling, there are, just from precip alone, there's other issues with the modeling that's done, but just from precip alone, you have 8.3 million properties that have that level of risk that would be defined as a special flood hazard area, but are not included in the NOAA SFHA, the special flood hazard area. So all of these properties have that level of risk and have no idea because they aren't being communicated with it. Now, FEMA came out with risk rating 2.0, which is great. Like, it is a very, very good step forward in how we are pricing and operating the National Flood Insurance Program. It allows for the inclusion of precipitation in the pricing of risk, along with other things that aren't included in the current version of the SFHA. The only problem that we see with that is that the special flood hazard areas are staying the same because it is dictated by Congress on how the methodological approach is created and how you create these maps. But the pricing model is different. So you can end up with people that don't know they have risk. They see something like flood factor, they type in their address, they see that they have this level of risk, they go to get a quote, and they find out that there is a very high premium required for that property because there's a lot of flood risk. And so this is one of the things that is this unknown flood risk that is much greater than we had originally thought, because with this new precipitation model, you could have looked at this previously just with Atlas 14, as we did within our first model when we launched our flood model, and we saw a big delta. But now it's even greater because we've added in this new First Street Foundation precipitation model, and that number's at 8.3 million now. So it just goes to show that how important precipitation alone is from a flood modeling standpoint. Jeremy, I don't know if you had anything else to add on that.
I think just to tie up some of the things that you pointed out, our initial assessment did include Atlas 14 as our precipitation input into our flood model, which includes precipitation, coastal sources, and riverine flooding. So we had all three sources, but we were including Atlas 14 as our precipitation estimate. That's what you'll currently see on risk factor, which we're updating with our new precipitation model. But that difference from the FEMA special flood hazard area showed that about 1.7 times as many properties in the U.S. had a 1 in 100-year flood risk than what was in the special flood hazard area. When we updated to our new precipitation model, adding in the new model that Jung Ho led the research on, now we see a difference of 2.2 times as many properties have the 1 in 100-year flood risk, which would be equivalent to the flood risk in the special flood hazard area. If FEMA acknowledges main river channels and coastal flooding are the primary places where FEMA special flood hazard areas are implemented. Small waterways, precipitation, pluvial flooding areas are not part of their model. So they understand that. There's a reason why the gap exists, because those aren't included in the model. But it does go to show you that if we're interested in 100-year flood zone flooding, that about half of the properties at risk of that flooding across the country don't know that they have that risk, specifically because we don't have the precipitation flooding in the special flood hazard area models or the small waterway flooding. And that while they're not part of the grand design of the creation of special flood hazard areas, these people flood and they don't actually know it because there's no other real public facing tool that people can look at to understand what their flood risk is. So just by adding in, just to sum that up, I think just by adding in the new precipitation model, it does give us the ability to start to understand how big that gap is with the adjustments that are likely to happen between NOAA Atlas 14 and the new NOAA Atlas 15 product that'll be produced as well.
Great. So that is our presentation today. There are 75 questions in the queue, which we will not be able to get to all of them. And looking through them, there's a big mixture between very technical questions that would be much more for Jung Ho and Jeremy, and some other just normal run-of-the-mill questions, which I'm able to answer. So I'll try and mix the two together as we go through these, so it makes sense for everyone, and we'll get through as many as we can in the next 14 minutes. So one general observation, you hear us talk about the First Street Foundation flood model and the First Street Foundation precipitation model. In 2020, about 3 years ago, almost to the date, we launched our flood factor product and our model overall. Since then, we've been updating it with new property data, or as one of the questions was, do we take in local adaptation? We find local adaptation, levees, seawalls, pumps, things of that nature. We include them and we run iterations on that. And then annually, we run big updates. So what does it mean for the overall updates to certain hydrodynamic modeling techniques or whatever it might be? What does it mean for climate models? There's a few questions in climate models that I'll get to in a second. So this model run, we were building this precipitation model to now include in the First Street Foundation flood model. So on July 31st, we will be launching the new version of our flood model. And for our partners that have access to the data in bulk, we will provide an update to everyone to download with that. For folks looking at riskfactor.com, the new flood model will then be incorporated into risk factor. So any property that you see at that time will be based on the new flood model, the First Street Foundation flood model that includes this new precipitation model. So all of these things will come together in our flood model and be included on July 31st, which includes the introduction of the new climate models. Now getting into the more technical side, which will be for Jung Ho, is we then used CMIP 6, which is the latest generation, and we have incorporated that into the flood model as a whole. So one of the questions at the very end that I saw here, Jung Ho, is did we run into the hot model issue of CMIP 6? And if so, did we correct for that?
Yes, so we learned about which model is categorized in the hot model. And then based on what we did it for developing the change factor we call, which is one of the factor that will use it in the projecting the future flood risk or precipitation risk. Actually, in the technical detail in what we built and use it, actually canceling that hot model effect in our process, which means we don't have any issue with the hot model effect into our model.
Great. One of the other questions that everyone seems to be having in here as I scroll through is whether the presentation will be available. We will make the presentation available to everyone as we send out the notes. It'll take us a little while just to get all these questions together, write appropriate responses to everything, and then we'll send out the recording, the answers, and the presentation as one package to all the attendees. So that housekeeping aside, Jung Ho, Jeremy, there's a lot of questions, and there's not a specific one that I'm going to ask about, but talking about which there's obviously 1 hour durations, 24-hour durations. What did we use when we were showing these maps? And do we have other IDF curves aside from the one that we're showing in these maps?
Yeah, probably I can take that question. So in here, this presentation, we only presented the 1 hour duration and 1 in 100 year event as our representative, the map and the findings. And beside of that, we done 1 hour through the 48-hour IDEF curve development. And the main finding from there was like sub daily, especially under 6 hour duration, is really showing the significant differences between the NOAA and our model. So that is the main reason why we highlighted 1 hour duration and 1 in 100 in the presentations.
And I saw a couple of maybe 3 or 4 comments around what does this mean in regard to how we're measuring flood risk and if adaptation has been included. I wanted to make the point that the precipitation model is focused on the rainfall rate and the depth of water associated with that. That is integrated, as Matt mentioned, into our larger flood model. Just to answer the couple of questions that I saw that popped up in the larger flood model, we do have adaptation built into the model. The adaptation that we're able to find is certainly not exhaustive. We know there's adaptation both at the city, community, and personal level that we're not able to integrate into the model, but all of that adaptation has a design standard. In our flood model, as we create it, we allow that adaptation to protect against the design standard for the return periods that we're showing. So that gets integrated into the larger flood model, but the precipitation model that we presented on here is really just the precipitation input that goes into that larger flood model.
Perfect. And so there was also a few questions in here, Jung Ho, about just on the basic side of things of we're saying precipitation. Does this include snow? Does this include hail? What do we mean by that?
So the precipitation is cover all of them the water type in the atmosphere. So they're including the snow and the rain and the hail, everything. And then in here we mainly focus on the rainfall because we believe that the most part what we derived based on our model is really well represent actually the rainfall, one of the typical precipitation types.
Perfect. And so another kind of grouping of questions that I'm noticing is about the idea of a 1 in 100 flood standard, Jeremy. This idea that 1% is somehow the magical number that we should be building towards, or is there another way for us to be communicating that isn't 1%? Should we be talking about like a parametric model, which is a fancy way of saying the likelihood of a certain depth, or is there other ways of communicating outside of this 1 in 100, given that the 100 is always going to be changing over the period of time because the climate is constantly changing?
Yeah, and that's something that we've heard from a lot of people is both problematic in regard to how do you communicate that to other people in regard to what a 100-year event means, and how do we measure a 100-year event when that is changing in a stationary climate. I think the easiest, or the way that we've always relied on it, and the way that I think other hydrologists and precipitation modelers probably rely on it, Jung Ho can speak to this, is in regard to the actual probability of the event. So when you talk about a 100-year flood, a 100-year flood can happen at any duration of time. If you look, it could be a 1 hour or 100-year rainfall rate, or it could be a daily 100-year rainfall rate. So there are different ways to measure it from the different IDF curves. It depends on the duration of time that you're looking at. It depends on the location in regard to what a 1 in 100-year event, a 1 in 100-year depth for precipitation in New Mexico or Arizona might be much lower than what it is in other places. So it is a problematic standard for communication primarily, and I think a lot of us are really we rely on the 100-year definition because we have this FEMA special flood hazard area, which is the 100-year zones. It's really normalized the way that we think about flood risk, in the same way that 24-hour rainfall rates have been reported out oftentimes by the press and by the news outlets, and have kind of normalized the way that we think about rainfall rates. So I think there's a lot of different ways to think about this, and there's a lot of complexity associated with how to present it out. Probabilities feel like probably the easiest, cleanest way to present a lot of this information, but the depth of water and the likelihood of certain depths is certainly an approach that different industries have taken, and thinking of the insurance industry in particular, has taken in regard to measuring these metrics.
Yeah. And Jung Ho, I got a question in here for you that I'm seeing a few on, and I know our technical partners have always asked. How do we account for the shorter record length in ASOS versus Atlas 14? So we're saying Atlas 14, the long duration period is problematic because of this non-stationarity idea, or stationarity is applied when it's a non-stationarity issue. But when you take a smaller subset of time, how do you account for that? How can you just say 20 years is enough for us to observe certain patterns?
Yes, actually, the main focus on the developing our model was like let's build the model in constant the data and the methodology. So in the detail, like we built exactly the same period of the time, the ASOS data, which is the one precipitation sources. And then we believe the recent 20 year is exactly well represent what happened right now, especially extreme precipitation. NOAA, what they use it, the data, of course, they use the longer period of time. But when we're looking at the detail, there's a many gauge data. They already stopped operating 20, 30 years ago, but that data is employed in their development. And also, as they are using the stationary method, is really degrading their data into the more outdated data quality. So that is something the issue compared to the first street and then the NOAA Atlas, the technical detail part.
And Matt, I just want to clarify. I did see a comment. I think it popped up a couple of times. The 1 in 100 year event is correct. I should have been more careful with my language. The 1 in 100 year event can occur at different durations of time. The 1 in 100 year flood is certainly different from that.
Great. So one of the other questions that we're seeing here is this idea of compounding effects when we're looking at flood risk. So we're talking about precipitation, and then there's sea level rise and tidal flooding and storm surge, and bringing these things together. Can you guys illuminate a little on the idea of what that means, or how those things are accounted for in our model when we say, because we have a precipitation model, we have a fluvial model, which is a riverine model, and then we have a hurricane storm surge model, and then we use all of those elements with then climate adjustment. So how does that all come together?
I'm looking at you, Jung Ho, as the lead hydrologist who pulls all those things together.
Yeah, actually, the behind of there's a really complicated process to build all of them, the stuff, and then accounting for 3 different flood sources. So as we presented here, this precipitation part is gonna be our main sources that will creating the pluvia, which is the precipitation-driven flood hazard layer. And beside of that, we have also the peak flow, which is observed from the stream area. That's gonna be another sources go into our riverine modeling. And in case of like a coastal part, absolutely, we considering the sea level rising and then the surge impact by the tropical cyclone. So in that part, we also do the same similar analysis. They will help us projecting the current the coastal risk and the future risk. So at the end, we combine them with the regional manner, and then creating final version of the flood hazard layer to publish and release to the individuals and anyone who needed our data.
Yeah, perfect. So we are right at time. We received over well over 100 questions in the end. So it'll take us a little while to answer those, group them, write them up, and send them out. The webinar was recorded, as mentioned, which we'll send out, and we'll use the slides, which have all of the references linked into it. We saw multiple requests around, can we have slides and the links? So that'll all be a part of it. And I will say at the very end, thank you so much for coming. If you have questions, you can see my email at the bottom of my screen there. It's matthew@firststreet.org. Please feel free to reach out to me, and I will make sure that they get directed to the right place. If you're interested in partnerships or access to the data, please reach out. And there was questions around, can governments get access to this data, or nonprofits, or other companies? The answer is absolutely yes. We have partnerships with over 40 federal entities, federal agencies, institutional investors, state and local governments, down to as what you see within Risk Factor and integrated in Realtor and other things like that. So our whole goal is to get this data out there and to be used. So please reach out with any questions or comments. Thank you, Dr. Kim. Thank you, Dr. Porter. As always, very, very fun to be on a call with you guys. And thank you most importantly to everyone that joined today. It's always exciting to see the interest in our work and our products, and hopefully everyone gets access to the data soon and we can make some more informed decisions together. So I hope everyone has a great July 4th, and thanks so much again, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.